What's up YouTube, this is Tubedigga. In this video I'm going to show you my own personal workaround for achieving a similar effect to sidechain compression in the MPC Live. So in my opinion this is a lot more of a flexible way than using the LFO technique, which is a fairly popular technique to emulate sidechain compression in the MPC Live. In my project here I've got 3 sequences to demonstrate this. The first sequence is my personal method to achieve the sidechain effect. The second sequence is called LFO 4/4. That's to show the most common 4/4 sidechaining emulation. And my third sequence is called LFO offbeat to demonstrate why the LFO method is not very flexible and only really applies to 4/4 music or straight kick drums in your sequence. So let's first listen to the second sequence. On all sequences I've got drums on track 1, we've got a drone sound on our second track on all sequences. So the drums are just a kick, snare and hi-hat. We're on our second sequence and this is using the LFO method, and the LFO is applied to our drone. So let's go to our program editor and look at what's happening with that drone on our first pad. We've got an LFO, it's a saw shape, and it's affecting the amplitude of this pad sound, and the sync of that is set to half beats. In most other situations it would be set to quarter notes if you were just doing a straight 4/4 track at 120 beats per minute. But because my sequence is at half speed, I'm just using half notes. That's the only difference there. Let's just take a listen. So that's all fair and good and works as you'd expect, and lots of other guys on YouTube have demonstrated this, but the limitations with this are kind of apparent when you go to do kick drums on the offbeat or breakbeat music. So this works brilliantly for 4/4 because it's perfectly synced to the half notes in my particular case, but what happens when you try and put kick drums in the offbeat? Well, that's why I got sequence 3 set up. So we're using the same drone LFO program with that LFO applied to it. Let's listen now and you'll notice the kick drums are on the offbeats as you would hear in breakbeat or hip hop music. So those offbeat kick drums aren't applying any side chaining effect to that pad. It's just looking at the half beat sync that I've set it to. So to get it to follow those kick drums, this half beat sync won't work. We'd either have to modulate or automate that somehow, which would be a complete faff. We'd have to do some right automation in the MPC Live, and then we'd probably have to do a lot of fine editing of that in controller mode. So we'd have to go out of standalone mode, go into the software on your computer, and then do some automation editing. So that doesn't really work. So whilst it is a good effect and it is a good workaround, it only works for 4/4 beats. Let's go to our first sequence, which I've called Sidechain. So we're looking at our master outputs, and outputs 1 and 2 have got a VCA compressor on there. Let's switch to program view. And if we take a look at the drums, they're coming out of out 1 and 2. And our drone is also coming out of out 1 and 2. Let's switch to our drums, go to our pad mixer. And if we click on the snare, we can see that the output of the snare and the output of the hi-hat are set to out 3 and 4. That means we've got a lot more flexibility in what sound applies the compression to the pad sound. Because the pad and the kick are both coming out of the same output, the loudest sound coming out of output 1 and 2 is the kick drum. And it's making the compressor behave how it should. That is to say that the loudest sound coming out of outs 1 and 2, which is the kick, the compressor is pushing that forward, and in the gaps between those kicks and those offbeat kicks, the pad is being allowed to be pushed forward because that would be the loudest sound in the gaps. I hope that makes sense. So let's just take another listen to it. I've unmuted the snare and the hi-hat, and you'll notice that it's only the kick drum that is pushing that pad back. So it's a lot more of a flexible way to emulate sidechain compression. It certainly isn't the be-all and end-all of a replacement for sidechain compression until hopefully AKAI can implement some kind of side chaining feature into the MPC Live, but I personally think that this method works really well. It's working no different than if you had a full track made and then you were going to go to the mastering process and you're adding a compressor to give it that compression effect to get things kind of pumping, but then you're dealing with all the other elements. But this way is a lot more flexible than the LFO. It allows you to choose what sound you want to apply that to, and you can freely swap those about, and it allows you to have your other elements, in my case the snare and the hi-hat, just running on top. Let's just take another listen. So if we had loads of other sounds happening in this sequence, then the only real limitations are avoiding putting those sounds out of outs 1 and 2. You could do a number of things. You could just continue working on your track with those small restrictions of what sounds come out of outputs 1 and 2. Or you could just bounce your kick and your pad sound, although they'd be hard baked and you wouldn't really be able to do much in terms of mixing them thereafter. It's quite a good way of being disciplined in your music production and go, right, well, I want to make a track that's got that pumping sidechain effect. So I'll deal with that first. I'll export those or bounce those to audio, bring them back in, either run them from your programs or run them as audio tracks. That would probably be a bit better because they're longer sections of audio. And then you could just continue working on all your other sounds. Let's just take a look at the compression settings. Let's go to Channel Mixer again, back to Masters and our compressor. So it's a VCA compressor. I found this to work the best. I'm making the assumption based on some of my knowledge of modular synthesis that because it's a voltage controlled amplifier compressor, it's behaving in the same way as a VCA would. That's what a VCA does. The amplitude responds to control voltages. The other compressors I did have a play about, and the vintage one seemed to work quite well. The master one, not so much. So I recommend the VCA, but please feel free to try other compressors. These settings are applicable to the specific content that I'm using. They will change depending on what you're going to be using in your own music. Now, I'm happier to admit that it's not as a smoother ramp as that SAW LFO in the LFO workaround, but I quite like the effects this gives, and because of all the other flexibility it gives, I'd much rather use this method. I'll just let you guys play around with your own settings because it's heavily dependent on the type of content that you have going through this compressor. Stay tuned for the next one, guys, and I'll see you on the other side. This is Tubedigga. I'm out.